Thank you, Kendall, and good morning and good evening to everybody here. Thanks to the Global Sport Institute at Arizona State University and to Anastasia for organising this event. The past decade, I've been researching parkour, which has become perhaps the urban sport of the new millennium. A sport defined in its practice as exploring the edge and managing risks, so fits very well with the overarching theme of this conference. You might be aware of parkour. It's become culturally ubiquitous. This is just a sample of various images from film, video games, advertising, pop videos, TV commercials, which shows that it's been with us for a little while. It certainly exists in major urban centres worldwide and has an estimated population participant base now of around 600,000 participants, although we might see that figure. We've seen a rapid rise too in the sport in terms of the formation of parkour businesses around coaching, education, well-being, wellness, mental health, businesses that interface with stunt and film work and advertising. We've seen a growth in the formation of national governing bodies and an international federation as well, overseeing the development of parkour worldwide, although this is currently contested by attempts from the International Gymnastics Federation to poach parkour as one of its roster of events, presaging some moves towards Olympic incorporation.
Hey, Paul, so sorry to interrupt. If you could screen share just in case you hadn't done so already.
I have not done so. Okay, there's the images I was talking about, and we're just moving on to some images of literature that's emerged in the last few years. Really, we've seen a growth of interest and academic interest in academic literature, so there's well over 100 academic articles on parkour now. And in the last 3 years, we've seen some academic monographs that have emerged that explore parkour via ethnographic and autoethnographic research, looking at parkour scenes in Paris, Chicago, London, and other places. A persistent theme in parkour research is connections to space and spatial politics. And this has been used to theorize spatial relations, looking at its transformative potential in cultural politics through the lens of authors and theorists such as Henri Lefebvre, Michel Foucault, and Michel Tissertout, amongst others. And these theorists are there to help us understand parkour's challenge to the ordering of space and its intended use, and the possibilities for transgression and the disruption of norms imposed by cities and late capitalist societies. My research actually runs parallel to these investigations. I've argued that the majority of parkour academic literature focuses on the culture and experience of participation, and it tends to overlook the nature of encounters between participants and other users of urban space. So there are tensions to explore here in terms of the shaping of urban space as spaces for autonomy, creativity, and expression, and tensions too from the need to regulate the rights of participants in this sport against the rights of other users of those spaces and other urban inhabitants. More recently, my work has engaged with the idea of convivial public spaces in its concerns with manifestations of spontaneous gathering and the political and legal conditions that mediate sharing of space between peoples. So the thrust of this presentation is to engage with some important work that thinks about the nature of conviviality as it's expressed in cities. In particular, the work of Anna Barker, who's a legal geographer and criminologist, and her concept of mediated conviviality, which I'll come on to. So I'm going to argue that parkour participants are beginning to exhibit attributes of skilled mediation, and that there is now some evidence to show that self-regulatory practice and collaborative governance are becoming essential to a legitimized presence in the public realm. But first, I'm going to give you a little bit of context before I arrive to that position. So this context actually emerges from the UK, where we've seen a tightening of various forms of controls in public space for parkour and free running. You can see some of these images here, drawn actually internationally, that show the visual ways in which parkour is beginning to be policed in public space. We've seen parkour participants under pressure from law enforcers, from city authorities in terms of the sanctioning and zoning of particular spaces for practice, and by the implementation of local bylaws by various authorities, predominantly around concerns about threats to businesses and the buildings, business premises, and also some concerns around potential damage to World Heritage sites and sites of historic conservation designation. We've seen some interventions from police authorities that this is a sport that poses a risk to the participants that's too much to bear, and a risk to others in encouraging forms of antisocial behaviour and criminal activity. The real kind of concern that this is going to lead to a new generation of cat burglars. I don't know if that term translates. Internationally, we've seen research in Finland that shows dressers have been subject to a bewildered and confused public. Their playful practices and the affordances of the built environment that they're based upon have not been intelligible to all members of the public, who lack a familiarity with this activity. It's a relatively new activity, and the public are becoming a bit more wise to what it's about. So reports from Finland have shown that the participants have been subject to repressive police interventions, being asked to move on. Again, those kind of concerns about the integrity of businesses and the respect for buildings, trees, and conservation. So this leads us to the point that the creation of a ludic city, a playful city, is not a universally attractive proposition for all urban inhabitants or all urban authorities. There are actually limits to conviviality. Nicola Di Martini Ugolotti's research, and he's based in Bournemouth University in the UK, looks at Turin and looks particularly at participants from second generation North African migrants who practice parkour in regenerated post-industrial spaces in the city of Turin. And his research has shown that these participants have been pushed to the edges of the city. They've been subject to police intimidation, to judging looks, and they have limited linguistic capabilities and abilities to challenge authority and to negotiate a presence in public space. Going back to the UK, just over a decade ago, we had one of the first bans placed on parkour in England, in the suburb of Liverpool, which prohibited sport across the town on the basis that, again, that it would encourage antisocial behaviour by copycats poorly versed in the sports philosophies of respect for public space. That's a real part of the conditions about what makes it legitimate. And we've seen new legislation brought in England and Wales under the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, which gives particular legal powers to police and local authorities to start to remove people considered to be causing harassment, alarm and distress in a locality, and to remove people from those spaces for a period of 48 hours. And this provision has been used actually in some cases around parkour, particularly when participants have been climbing over rooftops of business premises, or across transportation bridges, or at the top of tall buildings. We've seen that globally actually observed elsewhere. We've got new legislation under the Public Space Protection Orders, which now has its own kind of growing body of literature, which permits councils to criminalise specific non-criminal activities that take place in particular areas. And this has been suggested as a piece of legislation that could outlaw and be used against parkour. Close to Brighton, a small town near Brighton called Horsham was the first community to lodge a ban on parkour using a public space protection order, trying to stop parkour in its town centre and the damage posed and caused to business premises by these dressers. Concerned too that it was very much an unsafe practice and it transgressed. So these various examples show that there's vigilance from the police and local authorities in the UK and in some instances worldwide for managing urban centres and making use of available legal tools to exclude what they and concerned residents and businesses couldn't considered to be an undesirable presence. These interventions actually sharpen the moral geographies of urban space, delineating more risk-taking forms of the sport as out of place, as well as enforcing the property rights of businesses and others. So the position that I've kind of researched this sport in is against this tide of intervention and control, to look at actually something else that is happening within the parkour scene, to look at ways in which the participants have engaged in kind of pro-social ways with authorities through processes of negotiation and facilitation, and also the self-modification of their behaviours in order to win space. So these actions really chime with the approach to the management of urban public space identified by Anna Barker in a concept of mediated conviviality, which was published in the British Journal of Criminology recently. And according to Barker, there are three kind of main governing mentalities to the control and management of urban space. These are preventive exclusion, which is around risk management and situational crime prevention. So it's about securing the city by removing potential offenders from the city centres, to erect barriers, control access, to undertake security controls, to remove trespassers. So this is about preventive exclusion. The second mentality is about reassurance policing, which is to build an impression of order and safety and to build confidence in the police to manage urban space, which we see through uniformed foot patrols, through street lighting, the presence of guardians, and also well-tended, clean space that invites a variety of users to those locations. And the third mentality is rights to the city, where the aim is actually to protect rights for unmediated social interaction, where users themselves can determine their own use of the space. So at its extreme, rights to the city is seen expressed in things like movement. But, you know, Barker focuses on an idea, also a fourth governing mentality, which is around mediated conviviality, which is a deliberate strategy based on qualities of inclusiveness of use in public space, a form of responsive regulation where the aim is to mediate between diverse users of public space in a manner that is responsive to the context and the conduct of the regulated. So what we're trying to do here is to kind of balance the condition of contested space by working with authority holders and other parties in order to have a claim to that space. So I'm arguing that these things are actually starting to be observed within the parkour culture. We can also observe similar kinds of things that happened with state cultures as well. So we see forms of self-regulation and self-modification. The image you can see there, hopefully, is a sign taken from a parkour training area near London that asks participants to practice safely and consider the other users of the area, so kind of respect the environment and respect the inhabitants. You see those kind of normative injunctions that happened. We also see parkour community being very active in trying to mediate this convivial use of space through public demonstrations of their activity, where they can demonstrate the discipline required and the safety elements to it rather than the risk elements, in order to build that familiarity with the sport. The sociologist Geoffrey Kidder actually calls this hedgework, so kind of moving on from Ling's notion of edgework to hedgework, where it's about the performance of rituals of symbolic safety. We've seen too an explanation of the discipline of parkour to public and authority figures in an attempt to win favour for the sport. Seen through various forms of lobbying, various forms of documents that are written about the good kind of qualities and social benefits of parkour, which have been made to various city authorities at different power. And we also see a third dimension of mediated conviviality, which is about normative compliance, which you see on the signs here, and you also see on the signs and the advice given by the national governing bodies. This one comes from Parkour UK, which is the national governing body for parkour in the UK. where its code of conduct is to encourage and support a positive training environment for participants to be courteous when asked, and when asked to leave an area, to treat it as a reasonable request, and for the participants to be ambassadors to help the public understand parkour. So there's some aspects of the education of the activity feeding through. More recently this year, we've seen this initiative, which has been led by a parkour group from Scotland, and this has been endorsed by Parkour Earth, which is the emerging global federation of parkour federations, which is a blend actually of mediated conviviality, because the card actually has this condition about normative compliance to practice responsibly and respect others and respect surroundings, but also with this right to the city agenda, which I think is quite an interesting combination in terms of an assertive presentation of particular legal tools that are available to participants to resist authority and resist being moved off a place without due reason. It's quite an interesting intervention when we consider the age range and the education levels of the actual participants themselves. It might take quite a lot of confidence or cultural or social capital in order to show your cards to the authorities. So I've got some kind of brief conclusions from all of this stuff, really, and you can kind of read some of the publications that I've helped to co-author over the years. But I mean, I think this stuff really tells us a different narrative about parkour, rather than these adversarial, countercultural social relations with authority, which has really kind of excited sociologists in the first phase of studying this sport. This is actually about the work of doing parkour, of actually making it happen in different areas, a mundane narrative of collaboration, of working across organisations and authorities, and trying to understand the positions that they come from. So it's also interesting for how we see the growth of parkour groups and federations and other kind of training providers that have also tried to instill a set of normative compliances in the training offered to practitioners and coaches. So we see it kind of feeding through the participant base, perhaps, although that needs some further research. And we've seen parkour training facilities as material expressions of the legitimisation of the sport emerge, predominantly in Europe. There's a couple of examples in North America, but they've emerged through a process of community liaison and buy-in, and formations of collaborative governance between partners. So really, my intent in providing this presentation is to draw attention to this, and also from the kind of wider work we do within sport and leisure cultures, which has a great variety and strength to it, is actually to draw attention to law and property relations as significant power resources drawn on not just by the state or by other controlling interests, but as significant power resources for individuals and social groups to use as they take their sport development forward. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so we have a couple of questions here. We're going to start with Alex Channon. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Paul. Really interesting presentation. I just got a question about the formal bans on parkour, and perhaps also some sort of maybe sort of community-based complaints about parkour and so on that you touched on throughout the presentation. To what extent do this sort of resistance to the presence of parkour players in a city, to what extent do those discourses sort of replicate or echo a kind of racialized or class-based form of othering? Because I think the aesthetics of parkour and perhaps some of the more prominent participants in parkour that we see in the media representation, it's not a sport that's associated with middle-class whites, I think is probably my unenlightened view, but perhaps rings true. So to what extent do those discourses sort of attach to those issues?
Yeah, okay, great question, Alex, thank you. I think that there isn't actually very much research at all on the racialized dynamics of this sports and culture. So, Nicola Martini Orgolotti's work on migrants in Turin is probably the best example of that, which does, pick up upon the racial profiling of participants in the city centre of Turin, and particular racist police relations relating to youths who linger and loiter in the city centre. So there is a bit of work there. I think class is a different matter entirely. I think my reading of the sport, which I've spoken to lots of participants and travelled around the UK to look at where this developed, in particular parkour hotspots and training spaces. It's kind of taken off as a kind of suburban whiteness. I mean, it happens in fairly I guess the phrase might be middle English cities, and the suburbs of them, in housing estates, of working class housing estates, and it's really appealed to white youths looking to do something different with their time. So in that context, when I've gone to places like Leicester or Norwich, this is about a good set of lads, and it's predominantly guys, it's predominantly men, young men, who want to do something different with their lives, who've got off their butts to better themselves, train their bodies, and to respect authority. And they've been kind of swept into these forms of collaborative relationship that has actually won them dedicated parkour training spaces. So that's kind of been set against feral youth and gangs operating in those spaces, which have been othered. So it's a kind of very much of the English class condition of a white working class and an underclass that plays out in.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. All right, our second question comes from our very own Daniel Birdsey.
Yes, thanks, Carol. Thanks, Paul. Really interesting stuff. Really enjoyed that. It's a bit similar to the previous question. So thanks, Alex, for starting the conversation. But I thought I'd link it up. A few weeks ago, maybe it was a couple of months ago, I really enjoyed an event which ASU put on, where a number of speakers spoke about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and issues of sort of running while black, if you like. And I just wonder whether you might, we talk about sort of parkour practitioners as kind of being, to some extent, demonized, criminalized. But in some ways, if they are the kind of white demographic which Alex sort of alludes to, in some ways they're quite privileged in their sort of movement through space. The ability to run through urban space is absolutely racialized. You can't do that if you're a young black man or a young black woman, or you're going to have the pretty serious consequences, as we know. So it's kind of a comment leading from Alex. So don't feel obliged to sort of answer it.
Yeah, I think there's kind of all types of privileges and forms of criminalisation which have emerged from this activity. I think the big one for me is how we tend to criminalise children and young people's presence in our public space. We zone them, we contain them, we give them curfews, we place them out of sight, we place their practices behind hedges, we subject them to police interventions. That's the more scandalous dimension, which really